All right. A second thing I wanted to add is about inequality plus race and ethnicity. Okay. So in many countries, there's a connection going on. So the society is not just unequal, but there's also a breakdown which falls somewhat along racial or ethnic lines. So I don't mean it falls completely along racial or ethnic lines, but if you were to separate the distributions for different racial or ethnic groups in those societies, then you would see that much of the inequality is being generated by these differences going on. So they fall roughly along racial or ethnic lines. And this is a big part of the explanation in the countries that have really high levels of inequality. Often there is some gaps along racial or ethnic lines that are happening there. Okay, and these gaps tend to perpetuate themselves. So what I mean by perpetuate is inequality now perpetuates into inequality into the future, right? It continues across generations. And the reason why unequal access to education, right? If the land ownership and the property like house ownership and other capital ownership is skewed, then those things lead to more income in the future for the groups that have them, and not having that income in the future for the groups that don't have them. And this tends to perpetuate itself over time. Linguistic and cultural isolation. So in many countries, there are groups which are somewhat isolated from the rest of the society, either culturally, linguistically, or even geographically. So in many cases, these groups, sometimes they are minority groups, are also have lower incomes than the rest of society. So we saw that in the Living on $1 video. The group that was looked at in the video, they were from an indigenous group who did not speak Spanish as their native language. So part of their isolation would have been a linguistic and a cultural isolation as well. So these things definitely tend to perpetuate things, and there also may be in the society's current racial and ethnic discrimination, right? People may currently be discriminated for their racial or ethnic identity, but even if we subtract that part, these other aspects will still tend to perpetuate the inequality that we see. So a couple of examples of this. So Namibia and South Africa, they both have a small white minority with the income and wealth much higher than the average, and with a system that's not far in the past, which was designed to give them an advantage, right? And so as things have changed, especially, I don't actually know a whole lot about Namibia, but in South Africa, as things have changed, even as individuals from other groups have gotten more economic power, those have been individuals, right? Not the group as a whole, but still the unequal structure persists, and these factors I talked about before still are perpetuating themselves, and that's still driving a lot of the income inequality in those places. In Latin America as well, there are very high income inequality across countries. It comes down to several things. So many of the countries have quite a significant history of slavery, and it tends to be that the descendants from slaves were much lower levels of income on average in those countries. And also the marginalization of indigenous groups. In several of the countries that have pretty significant populations of indigenous groups, there tend to be much lower incomes than the average of the society, right? And plus this other historical concentration of land ownership. So I think much of the difference in inequality, for example, in many of the Latin American countries, could be looking at the legacy of slavery, which the U.S. also has. Our income inequality is also partially driven by that. The legacy of marginalized indigenous groups, which are significant parts of the population, and also this historical concentration of land ownership, which is tied together with these other two issues. So these definitely contribute to the higher rates of inequality in those countries.